Thank you for the click. My name is Luxeley. Today we're going to talk about Frost DKs. So grab an ice cold drink. This class is all over the place. Sometimes the needle is pinned to the right on one particular category. Sometimes it's pinned to the left. I think some tender love and care really needs to be shown to this class. I can't believe I just said that because I've always ragged on Frost DKs. Because aside from the single target damage, which is off the charts good, they don't do a lot of other things that are very good. Yes, mobility is better, but it's still less than. So we're going to talk about this. Now, I break this down into a few different categories, 6 different categories. We have single target damage, AOE damage, crowd control, survivability, mobility, and utility. Now, when I'm talking about utility, you got to keep in mind that I'm talking about something that this particular player or class brings to the group that the majority of other classes don't bring. A perfect example of this would be Mass Dispel from Priests. That's what I mean by utility. Or maybe some kind of healing debuff, or maybe some kind of other dispel. That's what I'm talking about when I talk about utility. Heroism from any given mage, shaman, or BM hunter. That's what I mean by utility. Now, the way I'm grading this on a scale of 1 through 5, I'm going to heavily weigh in on 2 factors. One is how Frost DKs perform in each particular category compared to other classes that are melee classes, even in some cases DPS caster classes. So it's all relative to what other classes are doing, what other classes can bring. And I'm also going to consider whether or not each particular category has improved from Legion or gotten worse from Legion. For example, anything that's closer to a 5 is going to be expected of having a nerf, and anything closer to a 1 is going to be expected to have a buff. Of course, this is my opinion. I also want to point out this is certainly not a guide. This is just an impressions video. But I did progress 5 levels as a Frost DK into BFA Beta, and I have a pretty good feel of what this spec can do and can't do. Single target damage. This category is pretty much a copy and paste from Legion. Not a lot of things have changed. Maybe the animations are spiced up just a little bit, and maybe the damage is just a little bit better. We'll get into both in more depth in a few minutes. Your rune abilities that are baseline, Obliterate, cost 2 runes, very much the same, copy and paste from Legion. Howling Blast, cost 1 rune. Frost Strike, Death Strike, 2 abilities that you use with runic power, both of which are returning. There is a small change with Death Strike, where your survivability is increased a noticeable amount, but we'll get to more of that in the survivability section of the video. The overwhelming majority of the talents that you had in Legion and PvP talents that you had in Legion are returning, and they will buff up those 4 aforementioned baseline abilities that I just mentioned. Now, this also includes Killing Machine and Rhyme, 2 abilities that have been around since Death Knights have been introduced into the game pretty much, and they're coming back again, copy and paste, very much the same. Your Mastery is the same, and Runic Empowerment is a little bit different here. You had a 1.5% chance to generate a rune with it. Now you have a 1.8% chance to generate a rune. That might not sound like a lot, might not look like a lot on paper, but it is noticeable. From just killing mobs, leveling, it's something I noticed quite a bit. So that is a good change. Now, your on-use buffs, like Pillars of Frost, is making a comeback. It's exactly the same thing with one pretty big difference, and that is it no longer prevents you or makes you immune to knockbacks. You might think, oh, no. Well, here, before you go crazy, there's a new ability, which is actually a returning ability from the Death Knight utility belt from the past, which is an ability called Death's Advance, which that immune to knockback aspect is going to be put onto that ability. The good news is you can use Pillars of Frost solely for DPS, and while the Pillars of Frost has a 1-minute cooldown, Death's Advance has a 45-second cooldown, so it makes a lot more sense, and it is a little bit of a better convenience. Now, what really strikes me as something very interesting about Death Knights is this last tier, Tier 100. Nothing's really changed here. Breath of Cinder Gosa, which was introduced in the game at the start of Warlords of Drain All the Fun, and it does a tremendous amount of damage, and it's a lot of fun to use, great animation. When it was first introduced, it actually healed the Death Knight as well, but Blizzard quickly realized that was not a good idea, and they took it away. Good idea for the Death Knight, most definitely, not a good idea for everybody facing the Death Knight, and the odds are you got to kind of try to please the people that are not facing a Death Knight, because they're the majority, overwhelming majority. So That's still a very good ability. It's on a 2-minute cooldown, and there are some restrictions in the sense that the target's got to be within that cone, within the wake of that. Some targets are highly mobile, like demon hunters, monks, druids, and it's something they can dodge and get away from a good majority of the time, at which point you either have to catch up to them, which is hard enough as it is, or you have to stop what you're doing and death grip them, at which point you're no longer using Sindragosa. It's a great ability, don't get me wrong, but it does have a few limitations, and it is on a 2-minute cooldown. It's these other two abilities that really interest me. Obliteration on a 1.5-minute cooldown. For 12 seconds, it allows Frost Strike and Howling Blast to grant Killing Machine. What that means is you're getting automatic crits on your Obliterate, and your Obliterate will only cost 1 rune as opposed to 2 runes. Now, if you stack this up with Murderous Efficiency, which gives you a 50% chance to restore a rune when you consume Killing Machine. Do you see how this works in great sync? Now you're talking about you have 12 seconds with this Obliteration talent where you'll constantly get Killing Machines and you're going to constantly refill runes. And this is going to give you a solid 14, 15, maybe up to 16 runes in a row. And if you're thinking to yourself, Luxeley, your math is off, or your timing is off, well, no, it's not, because what I would do in this scenario, when you have Obliteration up, is you want to hit your Empower Rune weapon, which is going to instantly give you back all 6 runes. That's why you're going to get so many runes. The combination of Murderous Efficiency and only using 1 rune on your Obliterate, and then plus if you get a Runic Empowerment kicking in there, this is just absolutely deadly. This is absolutely lethal. I think this is why you're looking at tremendous damage on a single target from Death Knights. Now, the last ability is nothing to fry at either, which is Hungering Rune Weapon. Empower your rune weapon, gaining 1 rune and 5 runic power instantly, and every 1.5 seconds you gain 20% haste for 12 seconds. Now, if you stack that with Icy Talons, which is in the first tier, tier 56, which is going to give you up to 15% additional haste by striking your Frost Strike, all I gotta say is, wow, with the haste. This is enough haste to make a Shadow Priest jealous. So you have 2 different builds that you could go with here. Actually, 3 different builds that you could go with. And I think when you have flexibility, you have creativity. When you have creativity, you have some kind of fun. Overall, I give it a solid 4.5. Now, don't think I'm getting too optimistic, because there are some categories where Frost DKs are rather less than, and we're going to talk about them soon. AOE damage. Let's figure out how we can do this very effectively when it comes to AOE damage. The absolute best build for a Frost DK when it comes to AOE damage is to play Unholy. I can't be more straight with that than... I can't be more straight when it comes to this without the aid of alcohol. Frost DK AOE is manageable. If you're a really good Frost DK, maybe you'll optimize it and be better than other Frost DKs, be better than a handful of other classes, but the reality is there's just so many classes that have stronger, more sustainable AOE than you do. This is pretty much a fact. Now, you have your baseline abilities such as Howling Blast and Remorseless Winter. You can choose Freezing Fog as a talent, which is going to increase your Howling Blast damage by 20%, and it's also going to increase Frost Fever damage by 20%, which is almost a must when it comes to wanting to buff up your AOE damage. It's a noticeable difference. And of course, you have Remorseless Winter. Now, you can go with 2 different kinds of builds here to buff up your AOE damage. It all depends on what you feel like doing. You could go with Frost Scythe, which is going to benefit from Killing Machine, and it's going to give you pretty decent cleave damage, so each Killing Machine is going to increase the damage of Frost Scythe and also make it crit. So that's pretty huge to get some cleave damage going on, but you're also proc dependent. Now, you could also choose Gathering Storm, which is in the same tier, where each rune that you use is going to increase the damage by 15%, the damage of Remorseless Winter, that is, which incidentally lasts 8 seconds and is on a 20-second cooldown. So not only does it increase the damage by a solid 15%, but it also increases the duration by a half second. So now you're getting up to maybe 10-11 seconds on the duration, and considering it's a short cooldown, you're going to be pretty active with dealing out a little bit extra damage this way. I don't know which is better, and the numbers are going to change by the time we do go live. And if this video gets a lot of views, a lot of likes, then I'll certainly do the research, crunch the numbers, and figure out what's better. But I'm not that concerned with that right now. This is a first impressions video. It's not a guide here and now. But there are two different options that you could go with here. You got to keep in mind, too, as a FrostDK, you lost Sindragosa's Fury, which is like you get on your cell phone, you call Daenerys Targaryen and say, hey, I need Viserion. She says, he's gone. He went to the Night King. So you call the Night King. It's more appropriate because it deals frost damage and just kind of swoops down. It's like calling in your own airstrike. You know, it did a fair amount of damage in PvP, a lot of damage in PvE. But the fact of the matter is, it was on a 5-minute cooldown. You didn't get to use it often, but it was a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun calling in an airstrike from a dragon. So it's not a huge loss, but it's a loss that kind of mitigates the fun a little bit. I wish Blizzard... I mean, how difficult is it to make a baseline on a 3-minute cooldown? Let's be serious. It wouldn't solve a problem, but it certainly would make things more fun and make the problem a little bit less noticeable. Overall here, I got to give your AOE damage a solid 2. You can make do, you can make it a little bit better, but there's just so many classes that are pulling better AOE damage. Crowd control. Now, if you were going to pick two of your weakest spots, two of your weaker categories in Legion when it came to a FrostDK, one is obviously crowd control, and two is obviously mobility. Now, Blizzard did improve the mobility, which we're going to talk about in a few minutes, but let's talk about the crowd control here. This is the big 600-pound elephant that's in the room, because the reality is, you have to suspend your imagination an awful lot to think you actually have some kind of CC, because you really don't. There's a line that wraps around the building with classes that have better CC. They have CC on demand, such as Mind Control, Fear, Cyclone, Polymorph. No cooldown on any of those abilities, and they could be spammed to the caster's heart's delight. What does the DK have that's like that? Absolutely nothing. This is problematic. This is also a difficult fix, and I'm going to explain that in a few minutes. But first, let's go over what DKs do have. Mind Freeze, which is a very good silence, but every melee has a silence. What makes the Death Knight silence a little bit better is that it has a little bit more of a range, 15-yard range, reasonable cooldown, very good cooldown. So as a Death Knight, you're going to have to get used to your interrupts. You're going to have to use them effectively. You also have Remorseless Winter, which is baseline, Chains of Ice, which is baseline. Now, Remorseless Winter is getting nerfed as far as how much it slows the target. In Legion, 50%. In BFA, 20%. That's a huge, huge nerf. But there are a ton of PvP talents that can administer slows, and there are just regular talents that could slow in different ways that you could buff up the damage, freeze the target, stun the target with Remorseless Winter, which is on a very, very low cooldown. So overall, it's a pretty decent type of CC, but it's not the kind of CC that just takes a player out of the game for a solid 6 to 8 seconds, so you could focus on a 1v1, or you can take a healer out of the equation, and that is problematic in threes. And it diminishes your value in Mythic Dungeons, and it diminishes your value in RBGs. There has to be something here. So you might think, okay, Dark Simulacrum, but you also need Dark Simulacrum to get some heals, so now you're using this one ability that is having a tri-function. In a sense, you're trying to get heals, you're trying to get utility, you're trying to get CC, and it's all kind of a random draw. Yeah, you could increase your odds of getting a particular ability, but no guarantee here. So it's not perfect. And now there are many different ways, like I said, that you could administer slows. You know, honestly, if you want to get a baseline CC, something like a Blind Sleep, which is a talent, probably should be baseline. It's a disorient, but once again, disorient isn't really completely taking somebody out of the equation, and this is something that's on a 1-minute cooldown. Something's got to give here if DKs, Frost DKs want something baseline. Something has to give, and it's probably got to come from single target damage. And I got to ask Frost DKs, would you be willing to sacrifice some kind of single target damage in order to get a baseline type pure CC, to take somebody out of the fight completely? I don't know what it would be. Maybe something like an imprisonment that a Demon Hunter has, where you have a talent where your Chains of Ice is an imprisonment as opposed to a slow or a root. Maybe something like that. Would you be willing to sacrifice some damage in order to get that baseline, or even just to have that as a talent option? Let me know in the comments. But overall here, this is pretty weak CC. Nobody's thinking, I needed Frost DK for a CC. A 1. Survivability. AMS and Icebound Fortitude return for an encore. They always find a way to come back for more of those two abilities. They've been around since the beginning in Wrath of the Lich King when Death Knights basically graced ourselves with their presence. And they continue to be around, and they haven't really changed much. Now, one thing I did notice about survivability in Frost DKs, I thought it was pretty decent in Legion. And I'm leveling on the BFA beta, and I'm starting to notice that the survivability just isn't quite the same, and I couldn't figure it out. Why is this? And then it just hit me. There are two artifact traits that you had as a Frost DK that are not coming back in Battle for Azeroth, and it makes a difference with your survivability. These are two key traits. The first one is called Mirror Ball, which AMS removes all harmful magic effects when you activate it. That's huge. That acts like a cloak of shadows in the sense that you're removing all dots. That mitigates a ton of damage. That is gone. So now you got to be a bit more proactive with AMS, and you have a very, very short window in which to do that. The other ability that's gone, which is probably as much of an impact as well, and anybody that's watched my new PvP clips where I make fun of other players and I make fun of myself and I make fun of the game in general, and basically there's just a lot of fun of people's follies in game, including mine, and some good things that they do, I would see Death Knights get these massive heals of 60, 70, 80%. And I was thinking to myself, Jesus, that's just unfair. And the reason they were getting those massive heals was because of a trait called Ice in Your Veins, where Death Strike increases your overall, it's the overall efficiency of Death Strike is increased by 400% if Icebound Fortitude is active. Now that is what leads to a 40, 50, I'm saying 40, let's double it. Let's go 60, 70, 80% heal. I have it on videotape. I've seen it happen quite a few times, a noticeable amount of times. That's a massive heal. That's a huge nerf to survivability here because that ability is gone. Now what Blizzard did to make up for this is they basically added a little bit of a buff to Death Strike, which I had mentioned in the single target section or category of this video. Death Strike heals for 20% of the damage that you do over the last X amount of seconds. That's how it was in Legion. Now in BFA, it's 45% of that. It's actually not the damage you do, it's the damage you take. So Blizzard is just trying to force people to use that more effectively, and they're giving them a little bit of a reward. What is that? That's over 100% increase. So it's a huge increase, but it still doesn't make up for that 400% buff that you got to Death Strike when you used it while Icebound Fortitude was up. That was just absolutely huge, especially if you took a ton of damage prior to that. And that's why you were seeing 60, 70, 80% health increases from Death Knights. So this is what really drives down the overall survivability for Death Knights. There's really no healing mechanism, except in PvP. You're going to have to use Dark Simulacrum in order to steal HOTS, and when you're stealing HOTS, you're really not stealing much. That's going to make a massive immediate difference. So overall, I have to give the survivability. Your mobility is increased, so we got to take that into account. But I have to give your survivability maybe a 2.5, a 3, somewhere in the middle there. Just because your mobility is going to be increased, which we're going to talk about. Mobility can lead you to prevent bad situations. So somewhere between a 2.5 and a 3. I can't quite decide. We'll talk more about that in the mobility category. Mobility. Basically, Death Knights have been about as mobile as a stop sign in PvP. This goes back to, gosh, for a very, very long time. But even worse, throughout Warlords of Draenor and Legion, well, things are getting better. I won't say that the problem is completely solved, but you're not quite as vulnerable. Wraithwalk makes a return, but it is no longer baseline. It is now a talent. The cooldown has gone from 45 seconds to 1 minute. You might think, dude, what are you talking about? No mobility here. Well, yes, there is a new ability. Actually, it's a returning ability from the old Bat utility belt from DKs. It's called Death's Advance, and this is going to be baseline. So here's what Death's Advance does. It gives you a 30% speed buff, and you can't have your speed reduced below 70%. So Frost Mages are crying right now. And it makes you immune to forced movement effects. I'm really trying to figure out what that is. My guess is slows. I don't really know. I could mean force movement effect would be mind control. I'm not sure. I'm curious, but I'm not sure what Blizzard means by that. But what I do know is that it makes you immune to knockbacks, which is something that was taken from Pillars of Frost and put on Death's Advance. You still have Chains of Ice, and there's a talent where you can double up on Chains of Ice and root the target. You still have Death Grip, and overall here, I think that your mobility is improved, noticeably improved, but you're still not a monk. You're still not a Death Knight. You're still not a Demon Hunter. You're still not a Druid. There's still a lot of, even warriors, I would say, have better mobility than a Death Knight overall. But you do have that wonderful gap closer with Death Grip here. I got to give it a solid 3. In Legion, I would have given it maybe a 1 or a 2. It's a little bit better, and when you have greater mobility, it does add to your overall survivability as well. A solid 3. Utility. For all you math majors out there, what's 101 minus 101? The answer is 0. And get used to 0 because you have absolutely no utility as a Death Knight. Now, what do I mean by utility? I'm not talking about the value that you bring to a group. Obviously, if you have killer single target damage, or you maximize your AOE damage, or you have decent mobility to catch up with people and then administer your single target damage, the fact of the matter is they add value, but they don't add utility. Utility is something that you bring that buffs up your entire group, whether it's passive or active, and it's also something that you bring that other classes can't do that pretty much benefits the overall group. For example, Mass Dispel from priests, Heroism from any given mage, BM hunter, or shaman. What is it that DKs bring? And the answer is pretty much nothing. They really have to be crafty with Dark Simulacrum and PvP, and really just show that they could just take out targets quickly and effectively. There's no utility here. I can't even pretend that there's any utility. Now, initially, in an earlier build on the BFA beta, Blizzard did implement this new ability called Reap Magic, which had a 40-yard range, a 10-second cooldown, and it cost absolutely nothing to use. And what it did, it would reap a beneficial magic ability from a target and give you 25 runic power, which is pretty damn cool. And it adds to the overall value of the group because you're dispelling something, kind of like a priest dispel. This was a nice addition for Death Knights, and they took it away. I don't understand how a particular class that has no CC and has no utility is going to bring value to a group unless you're really kicking ass with single target damage, which you can do, but there's better ways to do things, bro. I don't get it. The overall utility a Death Knight brings is a solid 1 now. Even with Reap Magic, maybe put it in at a solid 3, but that's better than some classes. But I can't think of a single class that has less group utility than a Death Knight. Let me know if you can. This is Luxeley saying, whatever it is by you, whether it's morning, noon, or night, I thank you for the click. There's 2 more videos you can watch, but whatever it is by you, morning, afternoon, or night, make it epic.